How did Henry VIII become one of the most powerful kings in history by destroying every woman who stood beside him? 6 queens entered his world wearing white. Some left headless. Some left lifeless. One left in silence so complete that even the church bells refused to toll. When a man believes that his love is divine law, every woman becomes a sacrifice waiting to be named. Catherine of Aragon gave him her youth. Anne Boleyn gave him a new church. Jane Seymour gave him a son. Anne of Cleves gave him a treaty. Catherine Howard gave him excitement. Catherine Parr gave him peace. Yet none of them were allowed to keep their lives without a cost. They were not just wives. They were offerings placed at the feet of a throne that demanded obedience more than affection. One queen died behind cold walls with no title, no crown, no comfort. Another rehearsed her death the night before, placing her head against the block to make sure she would not tremble. A third smiled at the sword, as if to remind the world she still had dignity, even if they took her name. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a tragedy either. This is a pattern, a system dressed in velvet, stitched in gold, soaked in the tears of 6 women who all believed, for a moment, that they were safe. But the crown does not share its power, not with love, not with loyalty, not even with life. So ask yourself, how does a queen die like an animal, discarded and unloved, by the man who once called her the mother of a nation? And how does a man like Henry VIII get to write his story in stone, while the women he destroyed fade into shadows? Before there were 6 wives, there was only one, and she was everything the crown claimed to value: piety, loyalty, nobility, dignity. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, born into a royal bloodline steeped in conquest and faith. She was raised to be a queen, not just a wife, but a sovereign partner. She was taught to kneel only before God. When she married Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII, England saw an alliance of kingdoms. But Arthur died after just 5 months. Catherine was left widowed at 16, and the question of her virginity became a matter of state. Years of uncertainty followed. She remained in England, politically stranded, financially limited, and emotionally frozen in limbo. Then came Henry, Arthur's younger brother. Henry VIII married Catherine in 1509. He was 17. She was nearly 24. He called her his beloved queen, his most trusted counsel, his one true match. For over 2 decades, she fulfilled every role expected of a royal wife. She bore him 6 children, only one of whom survived infancy. Mary, a daughter, not an heir, but Catherine never gave up. She believed, with unshakable faith, that God would reward her perseverance with a son. She fasted. She prayed. She wept behind closed doors. She endured miscarriages and stillbirths without protest. She remained Henry's queen in name and in duty. But as years passed and no son arrived, Henry's affection began to rot beneath the surface. He blamed her age, her womb, her failures. He turned his eyes elsewhere. Catherine saw it. She knew the whispers in the court. She saw the glances between Henry and the young lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn. But she did not retreat. She stood firm. She declared herself queen not by Henry's will, but by God's. The marriage, she claimed, was valid. Her title, she said, was sacred. When Henry sought annulment, he launched a war not just against his wife, but against Rome itself. The Pope refused to dissolve the marriage. So Henry dissolved the authority of the Pope. England broke from the Catholic Church. The king made himself the head of a new one. And in this new church, Catherine had no place. She was cast out of court in 1531, forbidden from seeing her daughter, forbidden from calling herself queen. Her letters were monitored, her visitors restricted. She was moved from palace to palace, each colder and lonelier than the last. The woman once crowned before all of England now lived surrounded by silence and moss-covered stone. She was allowed no portrait, no procession, no proper recognition. Even as she fell ill, she was denied the comfort of her child. Mary was her only surviving daughter, but Henry feared that allowing them to meet would reignite rebellion. Catherine, once mother to the future of England, was now treated as a political threat. Her clothes faded, her hands shook, her body thinned, but her resolve never cracked. In January 1536, she died in Kimbolton Castle, surrounded not by family, but by a handful of loyal servants. Her last letter was addressed to Henry. She called him her dearest lord and husband. Even after exile, humiliation, and abandonment, she chose dignity. She was buried in Peterborough Abbey, not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales. That was the title given to a widow of a prince, not the wife of a king. No royal bells rang for her. No great marble effigy marked her grave. Her death passed like a fading echo, but the silence was not complete. At her funeral, many wore black. Some wept in public. Even those who had once turned their backs could not deny what had been lost. England's first true queen consort of the Tudor dynasty had died not in war, not by scandal, but by slow erasure. Henry did not attend her burial. History often remembers Catherine as the old queen, the woman who failed to produce a male heir. But her legacy runs deeper. She was the only wife of Henry who ruled beside him for over 20 years. She held the regency when he went to war in France. She oversaw court politics with wisdom and restraint. She defended her marriage with courage that outshone the steel of any sword. And yet, when the curtain fell, she was written out like a wrong name in a royal decree. The crown moved on, but some ghosts remained too proud to vanish. Catherine of Aragon died alone, erased by silence. But her death did not satisfy the throne. It merely cleared the stage for another woman to walk into history wearing the crown of a queen and the scent of treason. Anne Boleyn was not chosen because of tradition, bloodline, or diplomacy. She was chosen because Henry VIII could not forget her. She refused to be his mistress. She withheld what others gave. She demanded marriage before surrender. That resistance ignited a fire in Henry that no priest, no advisor, and no law could extinguish. To have Anne, he tore apart the foundation of England. He severed ties with Rome. He crowned himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. And in 1533, Anne became queen. But her reign began under suspicion and whispers. She had many enemies. Some saw her as a usurper. Others saw her as a witch. Her coronation was grand, but her position fragile. She knew the court watched her with clenched teeth and hidden daggers. Her only true defense was her ability to give the king what he craved most: a son. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a daughter, a disappointment in royal eyes. Then came miscarriages. Then came the king's silence. His glances no longer lingered. His hands no longer reached. His words became cold. Once again, the Queen's womb had failed the crown. But Anne was not Catherine. She would not fade quietly. She fought, she argued, she challenged. She insulted enemies in court. She did not bow to the king's moods. She still believed she was irreplaceable. She was wrong. By 1536, Henry had turned to Jane Seymour. Gentle, quiet, obedient, everything Anne was not. But removing a queen who had once been the reason for a national schism required more than annulment. It required destruction. Thomas Cromwell, the king's advisor, orchestrated her fall with brutal precision. Charges were fabricated: adultery, incest, high treason. 5 men were accused alongside her. One was her own brother. There were no credible witnesses, no physical evidence, only statements pulled from shadows, from rumors, from the desperation of a court that needed her gone. The trial was a formality. The verdict decided before the first question was asked. Anne stood in the Tower of London, dressed in black and crimson. She defended herself with calm grace. She denied every charge. She spoke with dignity. But her fate was sealed. On May 17th, the men accused with her were executed. On May 19th, Anne walked to the scaffold erected within the tower grounds. She wore a simple gray gown, trimmed with ermine. Her hair was pinned up. Her eyes were dry. A French swordsman had been brought to do the work. It was said he was faster, cleaner, less painful. Anne made no confession. She did not beg. She knelt and prayed. Then she addressed the crowd, asking only that they pray for the king, for he was a gracious and noble prince. These were her final public words. She placed her head upon the block. Not a cry, not a flinch, only silence. Then the blade fell. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel. No funeral, no monument, no royal mourning. The woman who had been Queen of England, who had once held the power to change the religious fate of a kingdom, was reduced to bones beneath stone. But Anne left behind more than scandal. She left a daughter, Elizabeth. The girl born to disappointment would later rise as Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. The very child Henry saw as failure became the crown's greatest triumph. Anne Boleyn was condemned for not giving the king a son. Yet it was her daughter who would rule for 44 years. And the very church that condemned her became the institution Elizabeth would lead with unmatched strength. History tried to paint Anne as a seductress, a manipulator, a traitor. But perhaps she was simply a woman ahead of her time, trapped in a world ruled by fear and men too fragile to face their own desires. She died not because she was guilty, but because she was inconvenient. And in Henry's world, inconvenience was treason. The axe had not yet cooled from Anne Boleyn's execution when Jane Seymour stepped into history. Within 24 hours of Anne's death, Jane was already being prepared as the next queen. There was no mourning, no pause, no space between bloodshed and betrothal. The court moved swiftly, as if eager to erase the past by dressing it in silk. Jane Seymour came from a noble family, but without the fiery ambition of the Boleyns. She was quiet, obedient, and pious. Where Anne had challenged, Jane submitted. Where Anne had dazzled, Jane bowed. To Henry, this was not weakness. It was the calm after the storm. Henry married Jane just 11 days after Anne's execution. The speed was not romantic. It was strategic. The king needed a son. He had changed the church, executed a queen, and rewritten the laws of succession, all for one reason: a male heir. Jane's greatest value, in his eyes, was not her voice or mind. It was her fertility. In October 1537, she delivered a boy, Edward, the Prince Henry had waited decades to hold. At last, the Tudor legacy seemed secure. At last, the king had what he believed God had promised him. England celebrated. Bells rang in every town. Feasts were held across the land. Henry was overcome with joy. He named the child Edward, in honor of his own lineage. He gave Jane a lavish recovery suite. But Jane was not recovering. She had endured a long and difficult labor. Modern historians suggest she may have suffered from puerperal fever, a bacterial infection common in childbirth during that era. Her strength declined quickly. Fever, pain, exhaustion. Within days, she was bedridden. Within 12 days of giving birth, Jane Seymour was dead. Henry was devastated. At least, that is how he allowed himself to appear. He wore mourning clothes longer than he had for any of his other wives. He declared Jane the only one he had truly loved. He even chose to be buried beside her after his own death. But Jane never lived long enough to know this. She died not in the arms of romance, but in the cold grip of infection and sacrifice. Unlike his other marriages, Henry never sought to annul or erase Jane's memory. Her portrait remained in his chambers. Her name was spoken with reverence. She had done what the others could not. She had given him a son. But Jane never had a coronation. She was never crowned. She never stood before the people of England in full regalia. She never held the orb or wore the scepter. Her queenship was spent mostly in waiting. Waiting to conceive. Waiting to deliver. Waiting to please a man whose love came with conditions. When she finally fulfilled his desire, she died before she could ever benefit from it. She was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Her grave was quiet. Her body was placed beneath the stones without the public spectacle that had surrounded her life. She left behind no writings, no political schemes, no dramatic betrayals. Only a child. A single son who would reign briefly and die young. Jane's legacy was never hers to shape. Others defined her. The perfect queen, the gentle lady, the mother of the heir. But beneath the surface of that praise lies a darker truth. Jane was remembered because she died at the right moment, before she could disappoint, before she could age, before she could be replaced. She became the image Henry could cherish without contradiction. The silent queen, the fertile queen, the queen who never argued, never failed, never refused. The woman who died before the king's gaze could turn elsewhere. History treated her kindly. But kindness in history is often reserved for those who die quickly and say little. Had Jane lived, she might have learned the same lesson as her predecessors. That love in the palace was never safe. That devotion was a currency that lost value. That a queen's worth was measured in sons, not in self. But death sealed her fate before time could. She became the only wife of Henry VIII never to fall from favor. Not because she was loved more, but because she did not live long enough to lose his approval. Her triumph was her tragedy. Jane Seymour died in blood and silence. But the king still needed a wife, not for love, not for companionship, but for alliance. Henry's court looked to Europe. England was isolated after its break from Rome. A Protestant union could reinforce his authority and protect his realm. And so the next queen was not chosen from desire but from diplomacy. Anne of Cleves was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves. She had never seen England. She spoke no English. She had been raised in the Lutheran tradition and was known for modesty rather than charm. A marriage was arranged, and the king sent his painter, Hans Holbein, to capture her likeness. The portrait that returned to Henry showed a woman of poise and grace. She wore a dignified expression, framed by a rich gown and intricate headdress. Henry was pleased. He agreed to the match without delay. But when Anne arrived in England in late 1539, the illusion shattered. Henry, impatient and impulsive, disguised himself and entered her chamber unannounced. He expected recognition. He expected instant affection. Anne, unaware of the custom, reacted with confusion. There was no chemistry, no spark. The king was insulted. Later, he confessed in private that he felt deceived. He claimed she looked nothing like the portrait. He called her unattractive. He said he could not perform his marital duties with her. Though the wedding proceeded for political reasons, the king was already looking for an escape. The marriage was never consummated. Within 6 months, it was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation and her previous engagement to another nobleman. Anne did not protest. She agreed to everything with quiet grace. She accepted the king's decision and asked only for kindness in return. Henry granted her a generous settlement. She received multiple estates, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle. She was given the title of the king's sister and allowed to remain in England with financial security and social respect. Unlike her predecessors, Anne did not fight for the crown. She did not try to hold on to a title that no longer wanted her. She bowed to survival. And in doing so, she achieved something no other wife of Henry had managed. She lived. But survival came at a price. Anne was mocked in whispers. The court never allowed her to forget that she had been rejected. Her appearance remained a source of cruel commentary. She was invited to court events, but always placed on the margins. She watched from the sidelines as Henry married again and again. She smiled in portraits, but her eyes carried a stillness that history cannot measure. When Catherine Howard became queen, Anne remained in England as a guest, not as a rival. She walked the same halls she once imagined ruling. She ate beside the man who had humiliated her. She laughed when it was required. She faded where others had burned. In later years, Anne watched as Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, navigated the same dangerous game. By then, Anne was no longer a threat. She had no children, no claim, no cause for ambition. She lived quietly in the countryside, managing her estates and avoiding scandal. She died in 1557 at the age of 41. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to be laid to rest there. Her tomb remains modest, almost hidden, surrounded by grander names and louder stories. History remembers Anne of Cleves as the lucky one, the wife who kept her head, the woman who escaped the blade. But survival often requires more than luck. It demands restraint. It demands disappearance. Anne did not lose her life. But she lost something else: the right to be seen, the right to be remembered for more than being rejected. She was never crowned. She never wore the full regalia of a queen. She never held the scepter in triumph. But she held something far rarer in the world of Henry VIII. She held her breath long enough to outlive the storm. She was not beautiful enough to be loved. She was not powerful enough to be feared. She was just wise enough to walk away before history could devour her. Anne of Cleves lived by stepping away from the crown, but the girl who followed her walked straight into its mouth. Catherine Howard was not raised to rule. She was not bred for power or politics. She was barely more than a child when she caught the king's eye. She was his fifth wife, and by then, the throne had grown old, suspicious, and endlessly hungry. Catherine was a cousin of Anne Boleyn, but their paths could not have been more different. Anne had been strategic, educated, and sharp. Catherine was playful, impulsive, and tragically unaware of the world she had entered. She had grown up in the household of the Duchess of Norfolk, surrounded by young companions and light supervision. It was there that her earliest romantic encounters began. Not affairs of treason, but of naivety, teenage flirtations, whispers behind curtains, laughter in candlelight. When she entered the court, Henry was nearing 50. His body was decaying. His leg was ulcerated. His moods had darkened. Yet Catherine brought something that no other wife had: youth. She danced. She smiled. She called him her rose without a thorn. And he, in turn, called her his jewel of womanhood. Their marriage in 1540 was sudden, but the king seemed renewed by her presence. At court, she was celebrated. Music followed her. Courtiers complimented her gowns and grace, but behind the silk was a fragile mask. Catherine never understood the danger of being adored by a man who had destroyed the women before her. She believed she had found safety in love. She believed laughter was loyalty. She believed her past would not follow her. But it did. Soon after the wedding, rumors began to circle. There were whispers that Catherine had been involved with Francis Derham before marrying the king. He had worked in her former household. Their relationship had included promises of marriage, letters, tokens, nothing scandalous by modern standards. But in the eyes of Tudor law, if she had promised herself to Derham, her marriage to the king could be considered invalid. Worse still, while queen, she had grown close to Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Their meetings were arranged in secrecy. One of her ladies-in-waiting helped cover their tracks. Whether they consummated the relationship remains uncertain, but in a palace ruled by fear, suggestion was enough to condemn. By late 1541, the allegations reached Archbishop Cranmer. The investigation began quietly. Catherine was unaware. She continued to appear in court, radiant and smiling, until the trap snapped shut. Suddenly, her jewels were taken. Her rooms were sealed. She was moved to Sion House and placed under constant guard. The interrogations were brutal. Derham and Culpeper were both tortured. Confessions were extracted. Accusations mounted. Catherine, confused and terrified, was left alone with ink and paper and ordered to confess. She wrote letters begging the king for mercy. She asked to speak to him directly. She wept. But Henry did not answer. He had once adored her. Now he considered her a traitor, not because she had wielded power or threatened the throne, but because she had reminded him of his age. Because she had chosen someone else in a life she no longer owned. Because she had embarrassed him. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. She wore a black velvet gown and a white linen hood. Her face was pale but composed. It is said that the night before her execution, she asked for the execution block to be brought to her chamber so she could practice how to die. She spoke little before her death. She asked for forgiveness. She prayed. Then she knelt. And when the axe fell, the court finally fell silent. She was buried near Anne Boleyn, the cousin she never truly knew, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There was no funeral procession, no lasting monument, just a cold stone floor and the echo of footsteps walking away. Catherine Howard died at approximately 19 years old. Her reign had lasted less than 2 years. She left behind no children, no letters of state, no treaties, only the memory of a girl who danced in a palace that fed on innocence. History calls her foolish, reckless, irresponsible, but perhaps she was simply a girl placed into a nightmare she could not name. Perhaps her greatest sin was believing that love could survive within walls built on control and fear. In the end, she was not tried as a woman. She was punished as a warning. Catherine Howard died young and broken. Her blood stained the same ground where her cousin had fallen. Her story ended in silence. But the last wife of Henry VIII did not enter the palace as a girl. She entered as a woman who had already faced death and grief and chose, instead of surrender, to understand power from within. Catherine Parr was twice widowed before she met the king. She was educated, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply devoted to religious reform. She did not chase the crown. She did not flutter her eyes or promise heirs. In fact, she was in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, when the king set his sights on her. But she accepted the proposal, not out of ambition, but because she knew the rules of survival. When the most dangerous man in England chooses you, refusal is not a choice. She became queen in 1543. Henry was aging. His body had deteriorated. His temper had grown cruel and unpredictable. But Catherine was prepared. She did not try to seduce. She sought to soothe. She treated him not as a romantic partner, but as a volatile monarch whose pain she could calm with patience and intelligence. Catherine brought the royal family under one roof again. She reunited Henry with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both previously declared illegitimate. She played the role of stepmother with care, especially to Elizabeth, who would later echo many of Catherine's qualities in her own reign. But Catherine was more than a motherly figure. She was a thinker, a writer, a reformer. She published books while queen, a radical act for a woman at that time. Her most famous work, Prayers or Meditations, became the first book published in English by a woman under her own name. She pushed for religious tolerance and deeper scriptural understanding. Her intellect made her influential, but it also made her a target. Conservative factions at court feared her views. They convinced Henry that she might be a heretic. A warrant was drawn for her arrest. The queen was accused of challenging the king's authority in matters of religion. But Catherine acted swiftly. She threw herself at Henry's feet, declared herself his humble servant, and claimed that her only intent was to distract him from his pain with harmless debates. The performance worked. Henry tore up the warrant and embraced her. She had nearly lost her head without ever stepping outside the palace walls. After Henry's death in 1547, Catherine was finally free. She married Thomas Seymour, the man she had once loved, and retired from the court. But freedom did not come with peace. Seymour was ambitious and reckless. He pursued influence over the young King Edward and was later executed for treason. Catherine died in childbirth in 1548, just 1 year after Henry. Her daughter, Mary Seymour, vanished from the records after infancy. No monuments honor Catherine Parr as a mother, but her true legacy was never in heirs. It was in ink. It was in policy. It was in the act of surviving a court that devoured everyone who dared to speak too loudly or love too boldly. She was the only wife of Henry VIII to be both queen and queen dowager. She was the only one to be buried with her name fully intact, not disgraced, not erased, not abandoned. She was buried at Sudeley Castle, far from the tower, far from the thrones and axes and whispers. Her tomb stands quietly, bearing a Latin inscription that calls her serene, wise, and beloved. But history, even when it forgets, leaves shadows. 6 women stood beside a king who believed himself divine. 3 were cast aside. 2 were executed. 1 survived, but none of them were free. They were names on a list, faces in a portrait, tools in a lineage, queens in title but never in safety. Henry VIII died bloated and brutal, untouched by the justice he denied to the women who loved him. He was buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife who died before he could grow tired of her. But the true legacy of these marriages does not rest with him. It lives in the questions no one dares to ask. What does it mean to love a man who believes your life is a choice he alone can unmake? What does it cost to wear a crown that carries a curse? 6 wedding rings, 6 graves, 1 silence too heavy for stone. And if these queens still whisper through corridors of marble and memory, perhaps it is not to haunt us. Perhaps it is to remind us. Some kings are measured not by what they built, but by what they destroyed. If you believe their voices deserve to rise again, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Torture Throne and bear witness to the stories history tried to bury.